to be rich. We're all born to be, 'cause we are rich beyond our wildest dreams. That is what we have always been, until now it remains to be seen. Now here to come clean. We're all born to be rich, born to be, born to be rich, born to be. I don't measure myself by no man's perfection. I cannot walk his steps, they're not my reflection. Oh, I wouldn't want to walk in another man's shoes. Make my own decision, not what he choose. 'Cause I'm not playing for another man's team. No, I'm not living another man's dream. So come on, people, don't get it confused, yeah. 'Cause we are winning, we can never lose. 'Cause we're all born to be rich, born to be, born to be rich, born to be. I know it's true, I see it in my dreams. We're all born to be rich. My heart wide open, I see what I believe. We're all born to be rich. And one day we will all see what I believe.
Thank you for this wonderful performance. Jürgen Gadio, Born to be Rich. Welcome everybody at the first international edition of the Round Table Talk at the Resistance Museum here in Amsterdam in collaboration with Sites of Memory Foundation. Welcome everybody here at the museum and our viewers online. We have also guests tuning in online from cities from different countries. A big welcome to you too. For some of them it's already past midnight, so we are very happy that you are able to join us. For those who are here for the first time, at the Resistance Museum, we share stories of resistance in the Kingdom of the Netherlands, particularly during the Second World War here in the Netherlands and in the former colonies, for example, Indonesia, back then the Dutch East Indies, and the choices regular people made during trying times. The Round Table Talk is a series at the Resistance Museum in which we explore the narrative of resistance from the focal point of current topics in our global society. There's also resistance against colonialism. Our goal is to unravel and share new or so-called underrepresented represented perspectives, stories and approaches. We organize the talk with different partners, our speakers, and we invite you, our audience, to share also your ideas and stories. Tonight, we are going to look at the connected history of Suriname, Indonesia, and the Netherlands, and how different cities in these countries reflect on resistance. Our long colonial past has left its traces everywhere in all of us. We find them in our cities, built heritage, historical memories, culture, and folklore. They tell a complex history of oppression, resistance, emancipation, and glorification. Its legacy is present here today. We have a full program planned for you with live performances and conversations. The first part of the evening we will focus on stories and legacies of resistance, visible or underrepresented in the city's culture and architecture. The second part, we will focus on the role of art and resistance in today's society. We invite everyone here at the museum, but also here online, who is joining us tonight to bring their questions and remarks to the table. For those online, share your questions in the chat. My name is Arjuna Kandotti, and I'm the curator of public program Inclusivity and Diversity at the Resistance Museum. And I would like to introduce Jennifer Tosh and Katie Streek, founders of Sites of Memory Foundations, partners in crime and co-curators of this edition of the Roundtable Talk. They will be your moderators for this evening, but before I give them the floor, we will first see the after movie of their latest production, Future for the Past. Have a good evening, everyone.
You've come to honor the voices that will not be silenced. You must invoke the voices of remembrance, their right to be remembered. We will travel on the edge of the uncomfortable as we speak the languages you have forgotten.
In the middle of this city, under this green, green grass, this was the place where you were seen last. Time covered your grave, buried you in the past. We are here now, making your memory at long last, at long last.
We continue to travel on the edge of the uncomfortable. We keep listening to the stories, the voices from the past. Hear them now. They're calling. Will you listen?
From the beginning? Sorry about that.
You've come to honor the voices that will not be silenced. You must invoke the voices of remembrance, their right to be remembered. We will travel on the edge of the uncomfortable as we speak the languages you have forgotten. You've come to honor the voices that will not be silenced. You must invoke the voices of remembrance, their right to be remembered. We will travel on the edge of the uncomfortable as we speak the languages you have forgotten.
In the middle of this city, under this green, green grass, this was the place where you were seen last. Time covered your grave, buried you in the past. We are here now, making your memory at long last, at long last.
We continue to travel on the edge of the uncomfortable. We keep listening to the stories, the voices from the past. Hear them now. They're calling. Will you listen?
I never get tired of saying that.
Good evening, everyone. Welcome. My name is Jennifer Tosh, and I am the co-founder of Sites of Memory with my friend and colleague Katie Streek. We're really excited about this evening's program. And I'm first going to introduce myself to those of you who don't know me. I'm from New York, originally born in New York. My family all comes from Suriname. My ancestors from Suriname as well. And I am a cultural historian, also the founder of the Black Heritage Tours in Amsterdam, which you can definitely say was a way for me, a form of resistance. And yeah, I've been here in the Netherlands now for 8 years, working in this amazing space with amazing colleagues and collaborating on this topic for quite a long time now. So that's just a brief about me. And Katie?
Yes, thank you so much. Also, welcome everyone here in the space. It's really great to have some live guests that are allowed to join us tonight. My name is Katie Streek. I'm a theatre maker and programmer and a co-founder with Jennifer of Sites of Memory Foundation. I'm from the Netherlands. I'm half British, and have really found that since 2016 it's been wonderful to collaborate with Jennifer on our foundation, Sites of Memory. And just to give you a little bit of a background about what we do, Sites of Memory is a foundation that organizes activities around our shared colonial and cultural history from the Netherlands and also the former colonized areas. Since 2016, we've been developing site-specific performances, collaborating with various multidisciplinary artists who reimagine and reinterpret these histories and bring it to the present. What you just saw is a trailer of, or the aftermovie of our latest production, Future for the Past, which was a collaboration with artists from South Africa and was performed here in Amsterdam. And what we try to do is really engage with the specific historical sites and some of those hidden narratives that we want to bring to our audiences here in the Netherlands. And Jennifer will share a little bit more about how we work with these themes of resistance in our work.
Yes, for us, resistance is really very central, I think, to our work, right, Katie? We focus first on what we call these sites of memory, historical memory. That's one of the areas of my interest, particularly, is about historical memory and the colonial past, and more importantly, what's missing or hidden from that dominant narrative. And I think we use resistance as the foundation of where do we start, looking at places that can be interpreted, talking about how resistance might have been known, or more importantly, unknown, and hidden from public spaces. So we take these public spaces and really transform them using the narratives from particularly the book that I co-wrote. This is not a plug, but it is. Amsterdam Slavery Heritage Guide, which was co-written by 4 other amazing historians and researchers in 2014. So taking that as the foundation and those sites that have been researched, we then reinterpret them using dance, music, theater, spoken word, and music as well.
And actually this evening you will be seeing some of the performance snippets from our latest work. So you already saw Jürgen Gario with his music performance, and it will be followed by a number of different works. So you will get a sense of the kind of performance work that we bring in our productions. Just to step forward, we're talking today about resistance. And as our audiences came in, you were asked, what does resistance mean to you? So maybe just before we start our conversation with our panel, we would love to hear from you what your response was. So is there anyone in the audience, maybe a few people who would like to, the mic will come to you, but who would like to share your views and your ideas of what resistance means? So if you want to step forward, please raise your hand, and we have a mic coming your way. This is really an evening about having a dialogue with all of us, so it would be wonderful if you interact to just be part of the conversation. Everyone is very comfortable, but if there's anyone at the moment who would like to already share their idea of what resistance means, that would be great to hear. I'm sure Roberto has a very good idea. Putting you on the spot. I think they're also finding the microphone in the meantime.
Well, I can start by talking a little bit about what it means to me. And I think especially if it relates to the former colonies or colonial past, resistance for me is about how do we respond to the structures of power and how power or oppression because of power has affected it. And it's also a position for me as a Black woman. It can also take the form of resistance in terms of my age, because I'm often resisting how ageism is really sort of used in society as well. So it really does depend on, I think, the position of which we're coming from, your role in society, how the structures of power have affected that. We can see that I have resistance in terms of individual issues, but also global issues. Like right now, Black Lives Matter has become a very dominant in the role of resistance. So it takes on many forms.
Yeah. I think there is a microphone there. Would you want to share your idea of
I'll
your?
Try. I will speak in Dutch if it's okay.
Yeah, of course.
Verzet is voor mij in ieder geval een tegengeluid geven zodra je je niet helemaal meer senang voelt in bepaalde omstandigheden. En dat kan natuurlijk op allerlei manieren. Daar heb je allerlei culturele uitingen voor. Soms moet je ook een beetje activistisch zijn of zelf geweld gebruiken. Maar het is in ieder geval een tegengeluid wanneer je denkt dat of meent dat omstandigheden niet meer oké zijn in jouw ogen. Vrij algemeen, hè?
Nee, ja, dat is. Bedankt voor het delen. Ik denk dat voor sommige mensen is, for some people, their definition of resistance is very personal, or it can come to the very personal, or it becomes quite a big term. So I think that's a very good answer. Thank you so much. Is there anyone else who would like to share their?
Of the situations you're in, and it means certainly going against mainstream. And I know from people who are more brave than I will ever be, maybe, that it can also mean that you take lots of risks just because you know what's right and what's wrong, and you have a loud voice to tell people and to convince people. I think that's resistance. It's not without any danger.
Oh, that's beautiful. Thank you. Maybe a last person from the audience before we go on to the table conversation. Okay, then we'll pick it up here. Our first conversation is really also about what resistance means, the definition of resistance, but also cite historical locations that are reflecting these narratives. And we first want to start by introducing our guests for this evening, some of which who are here at the table with us. Wim Manahutu, I will introduce you first, an historian and heritage professional specialized in the history of Indonesia. And from 1987 to 2008, he was the director of the Malaccan History Museum. Since 2009, he has worked as a freelance curator, researcher, lecturer, and moderator. So thank you so much for being here. Maybe you want to introduce our next table guest?
Next table guest is my friend and colleague Raoul Belay. Hi, Raoul. Welcome. Raoul is an amazing visual artist, also known as Bastardo. He's a designer from Amsterdam. Raoul's focus is on themes such as cultural clashes, hybridity, exchanges, and transformations. He's fascinated by the way in which the dominant historical narrative determines the status quo. Statements, reporting, historiography from the status quo are often seen as the highest truth in his eyes. You want to add anything else, Raoul, to your...
No, I think that's the point of resistance, maybe from my side. I think we have an exploitative state of mind altogether.
Oh, I love that.
No, I don't love it. It's a problem.
It's a problem. I love how you stated that, yeah.
So, yeah, that's the work. So curating, making art, exhibitions, and working together with you also.
Great. Well, we're going to get much more into that. Katie, you want to introduce
Yeah, so just to introduce some of our other guests who are with us via Zoom this evening from Indonesia. First of all, Bonnie Triana, who's a historian, editor of Historia Indonesia. which is the first Indonesian history magazine and also a driving force behind the Multatuli Museum in Lebak. He's a guest curator of the upcoming exhibition Revolutie at the Rijksmuseum about the recolonization war from 1945 till 1949. So, Bonnie, thank you very much, and we look forward to continuing our conversation. Gustika, who is also online, is an independent researcher on gender, youth, and violence, a media content creator and published author. Her grandfather is Mohammed Hatta. And she holds a BA in War Studies from King's College in London. There's a lot to say about her, and we will continue our conversation. Thank you so much for being here, and wonderful that you are past midnight from Indonesia to join our conversation this evening here.
Yes. And also online with us is my friend Ida Does. Hello, Ida. Ida is a documentary filmmaker and producer. She works in the Netherlands, Suriname, and the Caribbean islands. She focuses on themes from colonial history, art, culture, social justice, and Caribbean pioneers. Her work has been recognized internationally with several film festival awards. Her documentary, Amsterdam, Traces of Sugar, became Best Documentary at the Caribbean Tales International Film Festival in Toronto, where Ida does also receive the prize for Best Female Director of Color. Congratulations, Ida. I've also been privileged to be in one of Ida's documentaries, so I'm very excited and proud for her to be here.
I think
also our guests here in the room, Quincy, now why did I go there? Jürgen Gario is the first performer that you heard to speak. Jürgen is a spoken word artist, musician, creative muse as well. I've had the pleasure of working with Jürgen in this last few seasons of Sites of Memory. So I can't see you, Jürgen, but welcome. And Jamacia?
Yeah, and Jamacia Oosterwolde, who's a performer, dancer, teacher. She was also part of our latest performance, Future for the Past. So thank you so much for being here, Jamacia. So Jamacia and Jürgen will join us in the conversation for the second half, where we talk about the role that arts play within these narratives of resistance. And first we're going to speak primarily with Wim, with Gustika, and with Bonnie. And my first question actually goes to Bonnie. We've been talking about what resistance means. So to ask you, what does resistance mean to you? And also, how does it play a role within your work?
Thank you. First of all, I would like to say thank you for having me here virtually. I would like also to express my gratitude to Verzetsmuseum, especially to Arjuna Kondoti, a good friend of mine, for inviting me this early morning Jakarta time. Resistance for me means that we can liberate ourselves by learning history. Because I still remember when I was child in my hometown in Rangkas Bitung in Lebak, I often heard the stories about the ghost of a Dutchman riding a horse. I was born in Rangkas Bitung, the place where Edward Douws Dekker, aka Multatuli, served as assistant resident in early 1856. And the story told that the ghost is the road to the back of the hospital where Edward Douws Dekker official residence is located. I always hear this story, and many people still believe that the ghosts of the Dutch are still hanging around in many places, especially in the colonial old building. But I wouldn't say that this ghost story become, for most of the people, the way they see colonialism as a ghost, because they always, remember the colonial time in always bad with sentiment or something like that. So when I was kid in Rangkas Bitung, the story about Dutchman ghost is always circulate among people. So for me, it is very interesting because when I initiated the establishment of Museum Multatuli, a number of students went to the street and they did the protest to the government of Lebak because they didn't agree with the plan to establish the Museum of Multatuli. But they never say that Multatuli is a ghost, of course, but they didn't agree with the plan of the government in establish the museum because they think Multatuli uh, was a colonialist, was a Dutchman. So they think Multatuli is the representation of Dutch colonialists. And uh, the student, I believe, they never learn or they never read about Max Havelaar, about the book. So they didn't understand that Multatuli was actually, um, fighting not against the colonialism, but fighting against the injustice under the colonial system. Uh, can I read my paper here?
Yes, please.
Yeah, for me, the history of resistance against colonialism in Indonesia did not only occur in 1945 until 1949. It was started way before the arrival of Japanese to Indonesia in 1942. History of resistance against the colonialists in Indonesia can be divided into three periods. The first is the Dutch colonial period, and the second, the Japanese occupation from 1942 until 1945. And the third is the Dutch recolonization period from 1945 until 1949. In the history subject in many schools in Indonesia, the Dutch colonial period was marked by resistance against the Dutch. The Dutch expansionist policy in Indonesia can be shown through the Van Hut's monument. Maybe you can see the image that I have. This monument, which was erected in Aceh and Jakarta in 1932. And the pictures that you can see, not this one, I think.
Those are not the right pictures. We cue up the pictures for Bonnie.
Okay.
There we go.
Yeah.
No, it's
Oh, that's also Wim's.
I think it's the next image.
We love technology.
Yeah. Okay, this monument, Monument Van Hut, was erected in Menteng area, Jakarta in 1932. The monument was very magnificent. The reliefs depicted Achenese, Javanese, and Papuans that symbolized Van Hut's success in conqueror archipelago. Can you see the picture? Because I put in pair two pictures, the past and the present.
Yes, I think they're setting up the
Okay.
images as we speak. So
Okay. And okay, the monument also show the action of resistance by the Javanese, Achenese, Balinese, and Bugis. Okay, in the left side is the present picture of Chutmutiah Mosque. So this is the place used to be the monument Van Hut was erected in 1932. And eventually, after the succeed in unifying the Dutch East Indies through a series of conquests, Van Hut was remembered as the hero. Van Hut also remembered as unifier of the Dutch East Indies, who was successfully integrated the archipelago into a colonial system. The Van Hut monument was demolished in 1953 as part of the people action against colonial symbol in major cities in Indonesia. Now, in the same place, there is a garden mosque called Chutmutia, while the road nearby is named after Teku Umar. Both of them are the heroes of Aceh. Previously, the street was called as a Vanhurst Boulevard. When Japan invaded Indonesia in 1942, the resistance continued. Not all the leaders of the National Liberation Movement collaborated with Japan. Some of the leaders, such as Sahrir, Amir Sarifuddin, they choose to fight against Japanese fascists from underground. Amir Sarifuddin even founded the anti-fascist movement. He was arrested and tortured by the Japanese, but managed to survive and released from jail alive. In time of Japan occupation, history seemed ambivalent. On the one hand, for the reason of political tactics, nationalist leaders such as Hatta and Sukarno collaborated with Japan, as General Aung San did in Burma for the sake of national independence. On the other hand, there is a dark side of Japanese colonial era, occupation era. The dark side was about the people who were forced to work on many Japanese war projects and the story of internment camp, which was the place for the detention of the Dutch women and children. That story lies in Cideng, a neighborhood within central Jakarta. We can still recognize the place used to be the internment camp for several old buildings. Some of them are gone and have turned into new buildings. Maybe you can see the picture of Cideng internment camp. I also put two pictures in pair, the present and also the past picture. So as you can see, the image in left, this is the new building. So this building used to be the place for the internment camp in Cideng, Jakarta. When Japan arrived in 1902, resistance continued. As young men who had studied history at school, I never learned that during Japanese period, there were Dutch people who were detained in these camps and had to live in terrible conditions. To some extent, they defended against the Japanese fascist oppression, as did those who fought against the Japanese from the underground. And when the Japan surrendered, the situation changed. And not far from the Vanhurst Monument, there is a monument of proclamation. The monument was erected to commemorate Indonesia independence on August 17, 1945. However, resistance to Dutch recolonization was carried out again. Not far from the monument of the proclamation, there is an old house occupied by Professor Sarwono Prawoto-Harjo family. In front of this small house, there is a small monument commemorated the pemuda or the young militia resistance against the Dutch colonial soldier who committed to a lot of violence at the end of 1945. So that is my short presentation this morning. I hope you can get my point. And I have shown you the picture from Cideng and also from Vanhurst Monument.
Thank you, Bonnie. That's
and
so.
That is now.
This is Jennifer. I just I want to switch just for a moment to bring in Wim to the conversation, because I think there's a lot of interconnections between your story and as well as Wim. So Wim, could you share with us, I think it's a good starting point, is what, in relation to the colonial past, because it's almost a two-part question, what does resistance mean to you, especially particularly in your work?
I think resistance, and it has been said before, it's not only about perhaps armed resistance or physical resistance, it's also mental resistance, resisting the fact that under colonialism, all people, colonizers, but also the colonized, are being forced to accept a dominant narrative, a narrative that has a hierarchy, and in the case of the Netherlands, Indies, and Indonesia, it places white people at the top, people of mixed descent below that, and the indigenous people on the bottom, but within the group of indigenous peoples, there are differences. And what I found very striking in Bonnie's presentation, and he mentions this understanding by early Indonesian nationalists, right? In the late 30s, Muhammad Hatta was exiled on the island of Banda Nera, one of the Banda Islands that played an important role in the beginning of Dutch colonialism as the sole producer of nutmeg. And he wrote letters in impeccable Dutch because he studied in the Netherlands, where he says, and there is this one letter where he says, well, to his Dutch friend in the Netherlands, we need to fight together against fascism, because if fascism in Europe has been conquered, then we can put an end to colonial fascism. So to a lot of these nationalists, especially when they were influenced by socialist or communist learnings, they knew the connection between totalitarianism, fascism, and colonialism, right? And so it's not just about physical resistance, it's also about mental resistance and resistance against these dominant frames.
Could you share a little bit about how this connects to your teaching, your work? I mean, did this influence your decision even to go into this deeper in your work?
If I have to be honest, this is something that came gradually. At first, I was just fascinated with history, full stop. And then later on, as I started to read books and started to engage also with people, and being a history student in the late 70s of the last century already, I was one of the very few people of color, which meant that if you wanted to study something outside of Europe, you studied non-Western history. So basically in the name of the things that you study something that is not, right? And so gradually you become aware that you have to be critical towards your sources. And at that time, government sources were still considered to be reliable. Oral history was so-so. It was subjective.
Right.
And of course, fortunately, we have come a long way. But there's still a lot of, one might say, knowledge production that needs to be deconstructed in order for us to really understand what has been going on. And of course, we don't have to start from scratch, because one of the relatives of Multatuli, Ernest Douwes-Dekker, who is actually a national hero in Indonesia, founded the Indische Partij. He was also exiled to the Netherlands because he was considered to be dangerous, because the ideals of the Indische Partij was an independent Indonesia, a multiracial, multi-religious Indonesia, and that for colonial authorities was, of course, extremely dangerous to have people forging alliances through ethnic and religious differences.
I'm just thinking of the guest who mentioned in her response about resistance, the risks. So taking a counter-narrative or really a counter-colonial position, what were the risks for you? Did you find that your research was accepted, or did you find that it was, challenged? How did you were confronted with that?
I had the privileged position that I was connected to a community organization, the Moluccan Historical Museum, where I had the privilege to work for over 20 years. And being in your own institution, and even though that comes with a lot of challenges, right? You work 24/7 because people will call on you, and it's not a 9-to-5 job. But if you like the job, it's great. But even though the Moluccan community in the Netherlands is, of course, a special community because it consists, to the large majority, of former colonial soldiers. So if you talk about colonialism, you have to be aware that you talk to people and descendants of people that were fighting and were instrumentalized by the colonial authorities, pitted against other ethnic groups. So Bonnie mentioned the Van Heut's monument. A lot of Moluccan or Ambonese, as they were called at the time, colonial soldiers fought in Aceh against Achenese who were fighting for their freedom. So the history is always very, very complicated. But nevertheless, being in a community organization gives you the opportunity to build on your own knowledge production. I'm over 60 now, but I'm still learning every day, especially also from younger people and from other knowledge centers.
Yeah.
And so, you know, I feel I do live in a privileged time where I can learn from artists, from younger people from Latin America who come with a whole different story of and history of resisting.
Yeah.
And so, in that respect, I think we live in interesting time. We see also pushback.
Right.
The fact that younger people are claiming space, are resisting in very creative ways. And I'm sure Raoul will be talking about this, but also in a non-violent way. We see that the violence comes from one side only. It's not two parties being violent. It's one party claiming space, wanting to be heard, resisting dominant narrative in a non-violent, creative way. And we see another side that is being violent in all kinds of physical, but also verbal, and I'm pretty sure that some people will be riled up by the conversation that we are having right now.
Exactly. You know, I'm thinking about this as a really transnational story, because when I think about Suriname and my ancestors and the history of resistance in Suriname, do you too also see the interconnectedness or how we can really link between Suriname, you know, the Netherlands, Indonesia? There are a lot of links as well.
Empire was integrated. So colonial officers went to Indonesia, went to Suriname. Piet Hein actually started out as a VOC captain in the Moluccas, as did Witte de Wit. Right, and of course they later became famous / notorious for what they did in Africa and the Americas. But we see that from the very beginning to the very end, there are these connections between colonial officers, but also the history of enslavement,
right,
and the fact that after the abolition of slavery in the Dutch Americas, they went shopping with the Brits, finding people from British India, but also people from Indonesia. So all these histories are interconnected, and I think one of the things that colonialism did was to separate these histories, and we have fallen prey to that separation for a very long time. And what is very encouraging to me is that I see that younger people are now reaching out and connecting all these histories.
Exactly. Look, if we could cue up your images that you have as examples of resistance, when the Ambon City statue, can we see those pictures? It'll be behind you. Okay. If you could share a little bit about what these symbols mean in relation to resistance.
These are two statues of protagonists that were involved in armed resistance against the Dutch in 1817. So after the Napoleonic Wars and after the British ruled over the Netherlands Indies, the Dutch returned, and almost immediately upon their return in the Moluccas, there was this large armed resistance, which was coined an uprising, an opstand in Dutch. But I prefer to coin it either as a war or as a form of armed resistance, because an opstand, an uprising is, of course, operating under the notion of there is a legitimate government and people are rising up, right? This is important, and they have become national heroes in Indonesia, which is complicated in its own way, but it shows that this idea that was very strong for a long time in the Netherlands, that the people from the Moluccas were all Christians, which is not true, have been loyal to the Dutch over the ages, which is also not true. And so it is important to, when we talk about resistance, to understand that histories are far more complex than just a very simple, superficial understanding of that history. And it means that for people of Moluccan descent, also in the Netherlands, there is this need of decolonizing our own history, to understand and to come to terms that, yes, our parents, grandparents have been complicit in the colonial apparatus. Yeah. Were they forced? Did they have a choice? And of course, it's very easy to say, well, they were on the wrong side of history. But you have to understand and come to terms to the fact that they were instrumentalized in fighting against other peoples in Indonesia for the colonial power, without disavowing your grandparent or your father, but critically engaging with history.
Right. Is there always a danger over time that historical memories or the legacy of these histories will change? How do you see, I mean, you were one of the contributors to the book that just came out a couple of months ago, De Slavernij in Oost and West, so it's very relevant for today. But how have these symbols evolved? Have they remained frozen in the sort of heroic stance, or have they changed at all?
They're evolving all the time. They're dynamic. And depending on the people you talk to, they each will have a different interpretation of a statue or a site, because in Indonesia, as they are national heroes, their resistance is very much linked to the emergence of the Indonesian nation state. Right. But for people in the Netherlands, these figures are extremely important, but they are connected to a struggle for freedom of Moluccans, which is not always necessarily in line with what is going on in Indonesia right now. And we see that all the time. And I think that the understanding that memory is dynamic, is changing all the time. And this is why it's so great that we are here in the Verzetsmuseum, in the Resistance Museum, as there is this knowledge that colonialism and fascism are interconnected. Right. Hannah Arendt wrote about this, Aimé Césaire wrote about this, the colonial roots of fascism, of Nazism, right? People have not understood that for a long time, but people are now starting to see those connections in Germany also. Right. The first genocidal practices were committed in Namibia on the Herero and the Sa people, right? So we have to understand those connections in order to really understand what transpired in Europe.
And there's another, I'd like to cue up the second image, which is actually very relevant today, that December 1st. Could you talk a little bit about, in terms of this image that we're seeing now with the West Papua?
The image we see right now are Papuan youth raising the Morning Star flag, which is a symbol of Papuan independence, in the city of Jayapura, which used to be the colonial city of Hollandia, because that is also a colonial practice, right? You name the colonial cities, Batavia, Hollandia, after the things that you are proud of as a colonial government. But the Morning Star has become a symbol of frustration for Papuans, because as they experience colonialism, it is not just Dutch colonialism, but it's also what they perceive as Indonesian colonialism.
Right. Which is an interesting paradox, isn't it?
Yes, and there you see the connection also with the Black Lives Matter movement, where Papuans, as they are dark, black people, are discriminated against. And especially last year, people connected this and said, not only Black Lives Matter, but Papuan lives as Black lives also matter.
Right.
And what was very, again, encouraging was the fact that other people in Indonesia, so non-Papuans, younger people, not only younger people, but especially younger people, understood that you can have a demonstration for Palestine. You can have a demonstration against what goes on in the United States, but if you do not confront the racism in your own country,
Right.
then it becomes very cheap and thin. But unfortunately, many people came out and spoke out
In solidarity.
in solidarity with the Papuan people.
Excellent. Do we want to bring Gustika into the conversation?
Yes, absolutely. So we're just going back to Gustika.
Thank you, Wim.
Thank you so much. Well, Gustika, your grandfather, if we go to Muhammad Hatta, your grandfather played an important role in the Indonesian road to independence. And I was reading an interview with you in Trouw where you said that you want to realize his dream in your own way, but according to his principles. So I'm just very curious how you have been doing that within your own career, in your own research that you have been doing. So how have you been realizing your grandfather's dream?
No sound.
Oh, we don't have sound yet, so
Hold on.
one moment. Let's see if the sound is coming back. Oh. It seems like your sound is off on your side. I don't know if you have a
Are you
mute.
muted?
No, we can't hear you. So we'll just continue while you refresh your browser. Thank you so much. Just to go back to Bonnie, hopefully Bonnie's sound is working. Yes, thank you. Great to have you back. I think we were just listening to Wim and also referencing these statues and symbols of resistance, and also how maybe just to make a jump to the current day, also within the Black Lives Matter movement, where statues have been taken down. And I'm just curious in terms of your vision on this. How has it been? You were also sharing an image of the Van Heus monument that was taken down during the Revolutie. What is your take on this taking down of statues? Yeah, how is that? How would you see it today? And also how we reflect on history. Should it be done? How do you relate to this? Oh, we can't hear you at the moment.
So we have the sound on for our guests is not working. So let's let them fix that. I just got a message though. I didn't know.
Hello.
Oh,
Yes,
here
we
go.
can hear you
Here
now.
we go.
Yes,
Okay.
Bonnie. Yeah.
What we have today, we can see a lot of event. On example, Black Lives Matters, and as a reaction, a lot of statue being destroyed, and it is remind me of what had happened during 1950s in Indonesia. A lot of colonial symbol were destroyed by the people as their reaction to colonialism. For example, the monument Van Heus. Not only that, a lot of statue, for example, city symbol were destroyed by the people to show their feeling that they are hate colonialism. So it also happened during 1950s, and we have the same situation now, where people doing the destruction to a lot of symbol statue that symbolize the colonialism, the discrimination, and also the racialism. In Indonesia, in 1950s, Monument Van Hertz also been destroyed because it is symbolized the colonialism. I do agree with Wim's statement about how people perceive history. For an example, in my experience, again, I share my experience when I initiate the Museum Multatuli. It is also about how people, perceive history. When I was a young student, I was taught by history teacher that colonialism would always refer to white men, to Dutchmen. And then when I grew up, I learned and I finally knows that colonialism is a system that involves not only white domination but also racialist, racialist thought, and also feudalism was also there. So colonialism is not only about how the white people dominate or control the colored people, but also it involves the colored people. I mean, the feudalism as part of the colonial system to rule the people. And I think this picture was never, this story was never learned in history subject when I was school. And that become, create or shape people's mind that colonialism will always seen as what you call it, as within the racism bias. And when we and as we know that in our history, for example, we have Henk Snevliet, we have Douwes Dekker, we have Ernest Douwes Dekker, we have a lot of Dutchmen who also part of our liberation movement. So for me, learn history means that we have to, what you call it, by learning history, people must realize that the struggle against colonialism was not merely about, or was not merely doing by the colored people against the white people, but it also involved many people who were realized that they are against the discrimination, that they are against the racialism. And this kind of racialism and discrimination was inside or was within or what you call it, was adopted by the colonial system. In Indonesia, you can, maybe Wim can add something. In Indonesia, we have regelments in 1954. That was what you call it, control or make the people separated racially. The first class is European. Second class was the Vreemde Oosterlingen or Far East, and the third is Inlanders. So people under colonial system being divided into three class of racial. So I think this is also very important for us to know that colonial was inherit the racial system to our life today. In Indonesia, if you remember, of in 2017 there was an election, and the racial issue was raised by certain politicians to against one of the candidate that have Chinese background. And I believe this kind of thought was inherited by colonial, because they have regulation to divide people from racial. I mean, it's racial segregation, something like that. So
Yes,
I think
I'm just
history is very influenced to shape our society today.
absolutely. Thank you so much. And I'm just going to see if we can make that bridge to Gustika for a moment to see how also nowadays young people reflect on these traces of our colonial past. So Gustika, let's see if your volume is working at the moment.
Hi.
Wonderful, we can hear you.
Yes.
Okay, great.
Well, maybe
I can hear myself as well.
yes. Do you just want to maybe first respond to? I hope you were able to hear it, to what Bonnie was saying, and also how these colonial traces are visible today, also in the racialized society.
Yeah, definitely. I think I would want to talk about the Papuan Lives Matter a bit. I actually wrote an article about it. So when the Black Lives Matter in the States, I mean, I think it was already there, but it just kind of blew up internationally in the middle of this year, and it just became a huge campaign, and it just made most Indonesians realize that most young Indonesians realize that they also have this sort of problem still going on in Indonesia. And going back to, it just sort of made me want to read what my grandfather wrote before when he was younger and he was facing the same problems. I recently reread his one of his essays titled Indonesia and Her Problem of Independence. And he was actually talking about race as well. And he was quoting also in I don't know if this is like correct to say it these days, but in the essay it says a Negro activist or something like that. I think back then it was common to use that word. I'm sorry if I offended anyone, but but he was basically making comparisons, like not comparisons, but he was talking about how the white race compared to the colored races in Indonesia as well. That it's not, like it's something that wasn't really talked about recently in my, in his, at least in my school, like in teaching and everything. But there has been a realization, a peak in the realization that it's a problem, I would say.
And just to go back to your own work, how do you see your own voice within this subject matter, and how do you see the legacy of your grandfather being pushed forward within your own work?
Well, in nature, I think as a researcher, my job is to touch on issues that are quite taboo, and resistance to me is not to blatantly accept what is, what you're told to do. And that's essentially what you do as a researcher. You question things, you research things, and you search for, other reasons to maybe, believe things. So it's about questioning whether it's right or wrong. And I think that's essentially it. And I recently joined an NGO. Today is my 4th day, and it's going to be my 5th since it's already past midnight in Indonesia. So I just joined an NGO that focuses on security sector reform and also human rights. So the topic is clearly, I guess, about resistance, and it is actually NGO which the Indonesian activist Munir he was the executive director of when he was killed on board a plane on the way to study law in Utrecht. And I guess I'm constantly reminded that, I have to be careful about, not being too blunt about things. But then I feel like that's essentially what resistance is. And I don't know how my grandfather would, going back to the question, I don't know how my grandfather really relates to this, to me as a person in that sense. As in, I think I see him as a very perseverant person. He was unwavering. And I don't think I am, 1/5 of the person that he was. And, people tend to, I guess, romanticize his stories as well. I think, going back to how history is taught in Indonesia, it's also about memorizing things, but also there's a lot of romanticization. When I visited the Netherlands in 2019, and I met a few Dutch people who had or have Indonesian heritage, and they told me about how their family were chasing away by the Japanese, and they were put in camp, and they were basically, sometimes they saw Indonesia as their home as well, but there's that dark history that we hardly talk about, and history is basically not, black and white, and that's, I think, what's interesting to me at research. And yeah, a lot of the stories that people tell about Hatta tend to be, black and white, because people perceived him as a very calm and collected person, and he really was. But then, rereading his texts and his essays, his speeches when he was younger, I did see a lot of, you can sense a lot of anger in his words, in his writing. So it would be interesting to also see that, in the future, because I would be starting another research next year about his contribution to Indonesia's foreign policy. And I guess that's how that sort of plays my current work. I don't know if that really made sense. I guess I was kind of mumbling. I'm quite intimidated because I'm speaking, with very experienced people here, with historians.
We appreciate
I feel so honored.
Your contribution is wonderful. And we could go on, and that's the challenge of time, of course, is we never have enough of it. Thank you so much, Gustika. I think it's a good place to kind of take a pause till we can really absorb all the things that we've shared so far. So this is a good time for another intermezzo with Jürgen Gario, and this time we'll be including Jomacia. So I can't see you guys behind me. Hopefully, you ready? Yeah. Go ahead.
So many bodies buried in time. Too many pirates, too many crimes. We give pain to love. Yes, we rise above. You count time. We celebrate the birth of new stars in the night sky. Way before El Wazine got the third star in her belt. Remembering is reconstructing the foundations of my family that are baked into the clay of this soil and buried in this body. This body is not a box built to be carried by someone who thinks it is empty. The space in between my heart and my soul is an endless gallery filled with the art of my humanity, in harmony with the living. We make waves with our feet at Hurikwajo. No more silence. Our voices in our tears. Trusting this moment in ourselves. Receiving the not knowing. The transparent is a comfort. Our bodies hold stories that want to be told. We are exactly where need be. collecting the elements of change. If your glory is connected to violence, do not repeat. Our voices, transparent in our tears, seeking transformation to set us free.
Thank you. We have a comment. Gosh, there's so many questions and thoughts that are going through. I know, Katie, yours as well, our minds. We want to bring the audience from online into this, in one of the comments from Marcel that I think is really interesting, is resistance to me is using any possible means to oppose injustice in the broadest sense of the word. For example, secretly spreading illegal, quote unquote, illegal newspapers with the truth, public protests. And there's probably another part to that as well. So let's move to our second part, where we're going to invite Raul and Ida, as well as Jomesia and Jürgen to join the conversation. You want to?
Yes, and I think we'll start first with Raul. Thank you for being here. Thank you for being at the table. I think we've already covered a lot of these different parts of the narrative and also how we look at resistance. And maybe just to start with the first question again, is we were just listening to these different, what resistance means to you. So how would you define resistance?
Well, I think there's a lot being said about dominance. And I think dominance is a key factor if we talk about resistance. And exploitation, as I mentioned in the beginning, is also something that returns again and again. If we talk about the Knil Malaccan soldiers, that's also a way of exploiting native people against their own people. But actually, I would suggest to look at an image I brought.
Yes, let's have a look.
Images tell us different things. I'm a visual artist at first, so exactly the image I was thinking about. Thank you.
This is great.
So I make art installations, and these are images that are part of an art installation. If you want to see the complete installation, please go to my website. It's an ongoing project because you can do this with a lot of images that are dominant in our history. It started out with a meme. It was on my timeline, of social media, and the meme says what history tells us, and it combines the image of the Titanic, the image of the Second World War, the image of the Twin Towers, and the image of slavery. There were a little bit different images, but it tells the same story, and it said, never forget, never forget, never forget, and the picture of the enslaved person was get over it.
Right. So these are dominant phrases that we hear often in relation to these images and stuff.
Yeah, within Western context, coming from different ethnicities and looking differently at history, a lot of times we're told like, it's so long ago and will you get over it? Except when we talk about the Second World War. And that's really strange to me. And when you start playing around with it in a visual way, it starts telling you a lot of different stories. I mean, if we talk about dominance and exploitation, if we take Lady Di on top, personally, I don't get why we're still honoring kings and queens who've been exploiting Europeans and people all over the world. No one. I mean, there's sort of a strange thing. It's a theme, becoming a king or a princess within this like Disneyfication of what it is to be a king or a queen. But I personally think they should refund us all.
And do you see, because as you say, an image speaks, well, it's a different form of expression, but do you see your work, your art as a tool of resistance?
Yeah, it's a way of resistance and also a way to keep sane. I think if we relate to what's happening in politics at the moment in the Netherlands, that we see that the extreme right-wing party from actually an Indo, who's the second Indo in a row who's running a fascist party in Holland, is crumbling down because of hate speech against Jewish people. Now, it's great that they're crumbling down, but where was all this upheaval when the last 20 years were about hate against Islamic people? Where was the upheaval when we were talking about the hate against black people, when we talk about the blackface figure? Where was the upheaval when we talk about Chinese people and the Asian community with the start of COVID-19? There's this... it's a bit the same as was talked about how colonialism made races and the one above the other. We see this also in suffering and the way we connect to different histories because what's taught to us. And that's very painful, I think. For me, the death of someone like Kerwin Duinmeijer in 1983, who was a youngster here in Amsterdam, a black youngster who was stabbed to death by a skinhead and actually died because a taxi driver wouldn't bring him to the hospital. I think, for me personally, that's way worse than what happened to Lady Di. I mean, for her personal family and surroundings, it's a terrible accident, of course. But if you look at society at large, what it tells us about society, the stabbing and the death of Kerwin Duinmeijer is much worse. Because it tells us a lot about how black and brown bodies are looked at.
And do you feel that with your art you also engage or you spark a certain dialogue? So how does your work create that kind of, how do you create a dialogue around your work? Do you? Is that your intention?
Well, I think art is a good way to open people's eyes in a different way. And I think also there's humor in this. I mean, the start of the meme was never forget and get over it, but now it becomes never, never get it, which is the feeling I get when we talk within the context of the West, or specifically Holland. I'm like, maybe 60 or 80% of the people is not getting it. I mean, if we talk about the blackfacing, today we had this huge racist attack on one of the most prominent black institutes in Amsterdam, the Black Archives. There's a mural on the outside of the building of the Black Archives, and it shows Anton de Kom, who's on the table over here on a book. He was a freedom fighter from Suriname against colonialism, was sent to Holland. This is the same thing as what happens within other parts of colonies. Was sent to Holland because he was a danger to the colony. Well, not to the colony, but to the colonial government, actually, I would say. Then he comes over here, but he keeps the same state of mind. He might have met Hatta as well over here. Those minds connect because they have the same train of thought and see the same faults in the system. He joins the resistance here, fights the Germans and fascism, and dies in one of the concentration camps in Germany just before the end of the war. Then Wim also tells us about Namibia and how the Germans did actually the first genocide there on the people. But what people forget really easily is that when Hitler and the fascists from Germany were thinking about concentration camps, they studied the reserves for Native Americans in the United States. There is this connection of all these histories that come forth out of colonialism that are really strong. And I actually wanted to ask you, Wim, we have this Van Heuts monument, right? Is there any resemblance with the Van Heuts monument here in Amsterdam, like in form, style?
No, that it's actually a bit different. But if you would like to compare the grave of Van Heuts has the same martial vibe, if you may. Mm-hmm. And it's not that strange because in the end, the son of Van Heuts joined the Dutch contingent of the SS during the war and was killed. Mm-hmm. So you see, there are these continuations of anti-democratic and autocratic ways and modes of thinking. Actually, if you look at the history of the Van Heuts monument, which was renamed in Amsterdam, there is some proof that the architect actually wanted to well, at least not go with this martial, male kind of portrayal. And it becomes a sort of a different monument. Nevertheless, it is definitely a monument honoring Van Heuts.
So symbolically, it has a lot of connection.
Yeah.
Definitely.
Well, I asked because the building of the Dutch Trade Union, which is the successor of the East India Company, which is the predecessor of the ABN AMRO Bank. I mean, criminals are criminals and they are like mafia. There's a copy of that building actually in Jakarta.
Yes.
Right?
You see all these...
This copying of buildings and heroes and heroic statues. Yeah.
And when Bonnie was talking about the taking down of the monument of Van Heuts, actually another statue that was taken down was that of Jan Pieterszoon Koen. And on YouTube there's this very short clip where it says, well, all Indonesians know who Jan Pieterszoon Koen was. And so they take him down with a vengeance. And so in that respect, of course, the uproar and the protest against the Koen statue in Hoorn has this echo in echoing from what happened in places like in Indonesia.
But speaking of the Koen statue, Raul, I still remember from conversations we've had, you had a very interesting take on what to do with these colonial relics, this historical memory, instead of taking down, for example, in the Netherlands, which gets resistance from people who believe that he should remain. Would you share what was your idea of how to address this kind of...
Yeah, I would start with saying I don't have a problem with taking it down. I think you can blow it up. It would be a great festivity for Old Year's Eve and start the new year fresh. But no, but if you want to talk about people not getting history, I would say let's fill up the marketplace with all resistance fighters from Indonesia throughout the ages and put a massive amount of statues around it. And let's
that would change the narrative.
Put history in perspective. Yeah. Because if you look at how Western-dominated history is told at us, that the people in the colonies were just suffering and they were not in resistance. It's also the same with how the story about Suriname is told. Well, Suriname, and I also use the term war, Suriname was a place of war for centuries and centuries. It's not like someone who worked at a plantation, was the head of a plantation, was chilling out in a hammock in the end of the evening. He was shitting his pants for the Maroons coming to the plantation, freeing people, burning his house down. That was the situation.
And speaking of Suriname, is Ida, are you on the line? I'd like to bring you into the conversation. Hi, Ida. Can we show the trailer before we engage on the conversation of the Anton de Kom trailer? I think this would be a good segue to bring you into our dialogue.
Mijn vader hoorde bij de groep die naar Duitsland getransporteerd werd.
Maar we hebben nooit meer iets gehoord. Nooit. Vanaf die 7 augustus 1944 hebben we eigenlijk zitten wachten. Amazing. Welcome to the conversation, Ida
Share a little bit about the background, if you will, in developing the documentary about Anton de Kom.
Hello, good evening, everybody. Thank you for having me. Well, the documentary is, it's already a few years ago that I did it. You know, I was commissioned by the Stadsdeel Zuidoost to do a lessons film, a film to develop education for school children. So we did that, and then I had so much material left that I did this short movie, and I traveled around the world with it, and it was amazing to share it with people in other Caribbean countries, you know. And then it struck me that we know so little about each other's history, and we still have so many stories to share. So it was an amazing and a very interesting story. But before I did this, you know, I was involved in the 80s. I was an activist, a social activist in Holland and in Suriname. And I was involved in actions for a petition to commemorate Anton de Kom and to restore his name. And so I've been along. I've come along with Anton de Kom. Up till today, I have a good contact with his children and his family, and we are always discussing. You know, isn't it amazing that 86 years after his famous book, Wij slaven van Suriname, We enslaved of Suriname, is so popular now, and it's almost it's a bestseller now.
Yes.
I think it's so amazing and great. It's a victory for us all.
That brings me to the question about the role that resistance has played. And Wim mentioned that it was a gradual process to develop your frame of reference. How did that evolve for you in terms of your work? I see so much in really presenting these counter narratives, contrasting against the dominant narratives. How do you approach that? Do you find that in developing the works that you do, the amazing works that you do?
Thank you, Jennifer. Well, it's, you know, making a film is quite a thing, you know, because you need a lot of funding and you need a lot of partners, and then you need broadcasters, etc. So 15 years ago, I started my own producers company. It's just not it's just a small company. It's just me. And I started to develop stories that I thought were important. And it was a major struggle, you know, because Dutch media are not really, they are not broadcasters. We're not really, I say were because it's changing a bit, but they were not so likely to go into in the stories I presented, because I presented anti-colonial stories, stories of dignity coming from the colonies, stories of resistance and struggle. And when I say struggle, I mean, like, I see emancipation in a broad way. For example, I did a film on Trefosa, who is a Surinamese poet, and he was the first one to write poetry in the Surinamese language. And to me, that was an act of resistance too, you know, resistance against the superiority of the Dutch language. And so, well, it's always a struggle, Jennifer, you know, but it's very rewarding because, you know, as a filmmaker, I've found also a natural public, people who are really interested and who are grateful for the work that I do. So the inspiration comes from that mainly.
And if you were to read, I mean, it's been some years since you produced that documentary. If you were to make it today, given that Anton de Kom was recently added to the Dutch canon, for example, would you do it any differently?
Yes, of course. You know, even the day after I edited, I would do it differently. You know, that's the process of creative work. and also, you know, stay connected to everything that stays in society. Because this work, I did it with his children, so the children are the only narrators in the film. And for that time, it was important because his children were old. His children are over 90 years old now. They're still alive, but the memory, you know, it's fading. So that was good for that time. But if I would do a film now, I think I would really definitely make a connection to young people and explore how they read the book now, and what does the book mean, and what does the work mean, and what are the ideas of heroism to them.
Yeah, this I could go on, you know, talking to you all evening. Ido, I want to bring, we want to bring Jamesia and Jurgen into the conversation as well. Katie, you want to?
Yeah, so
they're
I'm
behind
just.
me, so.
I think Jamesia, as you already have the microphone, maybe we would just like to know how you speak about resistance in your work, and also how you use your body as a tool to tell these stories.
I think for me, resistance means just succeeding in a system that's not built for my body. And what I mean about that is I was raised in an academic dance institution, and eventually I got sick. I got sick of, I think, the colonial gaze on the black body, and also the ability of what the black body can do. With that, I mean, if you look at the academic dance, Africana dancers and dancers from the African diaspora are not seen as technical and as professional. And with my work, I'm trying to switch that narrative and switch that gaze. And also in the way of teaching the dancers, because I feel that there's a lot of toxicity as well in that spaces. And that's also because of colonialism, patriarchy, and especially classism. So I try to destruct that and tell the stories based on my narrative. And also, what I also feel is that colonialism stripped us from the connection that we have with our ancestors and the power that we can feel within that. So I try to take that back as well. Yeah, and tell those stories. And also, our history is much broader than just colonialism and slavery. So I try to also get deeper in that. And yeah, just trying to exist, you know, and trying to get my company starting in this field now with Corona as well. So yeah.
Thank you. And in our last collaboration, Future for the Past, you were collaborating also in terms of the choreography with Luc de Kock, a South African dancer choreographer. I'm just curious, when you have this dialogue about our shared colonial history, what does that, in terms of your own style of performance or in your own journey, when you're talking about your individual journey within this decolonial, well, deconstructing this colonial structure in which you had your education, how did the collaboration with South African artists contribute to that? Did that change anything in you, or?
I don't think it changed anything in me. I just think it, how do you say bevestigd? It confirmed everything that I was thinking and feeling. But when you get into a conversation with the artists from South Africa and hear their story and hear what they go through also with their art, it just felt like even more of a connection that I created with them. So I didn't think it changed anything. It just confirmed my feelings and my hunches, and that I should keep on continue the work.
I'm curious about something, Jamesia, and this one question or statement that our guest asked is still resonating in my hand about the risks. Because I think all of us that are working in this space, we've taken great risks, you know, to our personal safety, obviously in some ways, some of us more than others, but also risk in being rejected by this sort of dominant society or narrative. In terms of your work, which is so emotive, and you use so many different styles in your work, were you ever concerned about the risk that you would take in not being able to create work or to get work in the Netherlands or elsewhere because you departed so much from, the traditional dance forms?
I knew that there was a risk. And I'm definitely not working as much as I was working before when I was working for the institutions. So, but I'm fine with that because when I was working for the institution, I was not happy. It was not coming from a genuine place. So I feel like I'm guided to work that leads me to work that is in line with my purpose. So, yeah, I was willing to take that risk for my own sanity.
I'm seeing Jürgen looking in recognition or nodding. So I'm quite curious, Jürgen, how, if you are listening to Jomesia, maybe you just want to reflect on your own views on the topic.
What I've been thinking since the question has been asked about what is resistance or what is resistance to me is the first thing that comes to mind is resistance is the first step of progress for everybody. To me, I also believe, or it's a hopeful thought, that I don't think the oppressor wants to be carrying that weight all the time. There's way better things they can be doing with their time than trying to oppress us. So it's a liberating thought to think that it will be progress for everybody to have more time. I was watching an interview today with Steve McQueen, who was on our tour, the director of 12 Years a Slave, and he was telling the interviewer who was asking him about his experience of everyday racism, he was saying, the moment that we wouldn't have to have this conversation about this topic is the moment you would realize that it wasn't here anymore. So that to me, in coming back to saying resistance is progress, and then the risk, yes, I acknowledge the risk. I also had a very tough time trying to do this whole college and university thing because every book I was handed had a white name on it, telling me that this is the way. This is the way of pedagogy. This is the way of social behavior. This is the way of institutionalism. This is the way of racism written by white people, which is, again, how can somebody who's never experienced it on their body physically tell somebody else who's going through it every day what it is? How come they get to define the definition? So that was my gigantic relief when I stopped trying to fit myself in there, but create something new in which I would have a say in what defines me and what defines my experiences. And as Jomesia says, when the truth rings free in you, I mean, the wave will be endless of what other people can pick up on.
Thank you. That's very beautifully said. And I think one of the, maybe to close off also this evening, Jenna was like, no,
more questions.
I think we could go on for quite a while, and it feels like this definitely needs a follow-up. But just to reflect on what, just as a closing questions and a bridge to your last performance, Ida was talking about the role of language within resistance and how speaking in your own language and bringing back these different languages is vital. And the last performance that you are sharing with us is a song, a poem about a butterfly, also in Papiamentu. Can you maybe just share with us what the poem is about for you, how it came about, and also the role of the language within your work?
I think all of us has a telephone with them, right? Telephones have a certain language that set them apart from being a computer or from being a camera or from being a microphone that I'm using right now. And this language, how it separates and differentiates and in a way creates a uniqueness, that's what language does for cultures, for people. It sets us apart so that you know what the wealth is of the thing by itself. It creates the context for the things around it. The language, the language creates how the people also define their freedom. It cannot be told in a different language than what is created by the person itself. And that's why language is so powerful. No one can tell me how to speak because I've chosen the words that I will communicate with, which is a liberation upon itself. Because before people were colonized, they already had sounds for the things. I mean, one of the biggest revolutions to me is when the kids in the townships in South Africa stood up against Afrikaans. And they were killing kids because the kids didn't agree with that. There always had to be, the colonizer always had to be the middleman between them and the outside world, which means trade, which means culture, which means advancement, which means progress. So standing up and having your own language to speak in, that's the biggest freedom I believe there is.
Thank you so much. While you are setting up for your last performance, we just want to close off this evening.
Questions, there's got to be some questions.
There are, are there any last questions before we...
In our audience, there's someone online, Dennis, who actually asked a question for Wim or anyone who might have the answer. Do you know about the resistance of the Javanese people in Suriname during the period 1942, between 1942 and 1949? So guests are trying to make links also in other ways.
A very important question, and I have to be honest. I should have to look into that. Fortunately, there are people in the Netherlands. I mentioned Yvette Coppijn and others who are looking at the history of the Javanese people who were brought from the Netherlands Indies to Suriname to fill up the places on the plantation, and they will probably know more about this than I do.
Yeah, there are a few sources, also documentaries about uprisings on plantations by the Hindustani workers on the plantations. But it's less well documented. And I think that's also something we, speaking for my own community, is something we have to level out.
Yeah.
How do we deal with also this colonialism and this ethnical discrimination within our own communities? For myself, I'm Chinese, Hindustani, African, Dutch, Jewish. It's a mix of this whole complete colonial history. So how come that we're so dominant on one side in telling this story and not so dominant on the other side? I think that's a task for our generation and the generations to come to also to come more together, because I think sometimes we are a bit too divided. The same goes for the people from the islands and the Surinamese community. I think we should and strengthen each other more. And I think within our projects, working together with Jürgen also and Jamacia and getting into this mix and inviting these different stories back and over and validate those stories from our own perspectives. Yeah.
So amazing that I think what I learned the most from this year's project with Sites of Memory, Future for the Past, is that we all have something to say, and that there's so many different ways that art allows us to push the boundaries, to use language, as Jürgen just mentioned, to use our bodies, to use visual arts, to communicate. So I think that last question for thought, maybe that we don't have time to answer for each of us, but what is the future of resistance in our work? What role should it play in defining how we move forward in the new year is coming soon? So I'd like to leave that question on our minds, is what is the future, not for the past, but for resistance, and how it should help us to I think, reframe our narratives, as you said, Raul, to think about the structure of power, rebalancing power. It's not about denying one group and replacing the hierarchy with another group, but it's about equal justice, social justice, and what role does that have in
rethinking the system also.
Exactly.
We're still in this colonial system of hierarchy, exploitation, living in the pirate capital of the world. It was the pirate capital back then, it still is. We got Shell, we got all these firms that don't pay taxes over here. We're the most exploitative city in Europe, I would say, in a way.
And it's really confronting these geographies of resistance, I think, is also something that came out for me, that it looks different depending on where you are situated, and that we all have to situate ourselves as well. I'll let you introduce the last.
Yeah, so
thank you, first of all, everyone. Yes?
Yes, thank you for our guests online, for Gustika, for Bonnie, for Ida. Thank you so much for being here, for our table guests, Wim and Raoul. And for the Verzetsmuseum to host this, Arjuna, thank you so very much. And Lisbeth van der Hos, thank you so much for having us here at the Verzetsmuseum. Thank you all at home for being here this evening with us. And now we're closing off with a performance by Jürgen Gario.
Meeting barbulette de mi sanger, meeting barbulette de mi sanger. Mita stima e libertad, commissata dimi. Meeting barbulette de mi sanger, meeting barbulette de mi sanger. Awa seru sempre ta muatera, terra seco sempre ta bindi solo, solo caliente sempre ta buta soda. Meeting barbulette de mi sanger, meeting barbulette de mi sanger. Trabalho duro sempre ta fortifica alma, silêncio sempre ta cresce voz. Meeting barbulette de mi sanger. Ora e barbulete papia, palabra te llega cas. Ora e barbulete papia, when the butterfly speaks, epic stories of freedom will be revealed. We will see endless gardens filled with rainbows of oppressed hope. Flowers in blossom. When the butterfly speaks, its wings will be camouflaged in seamless waves, shapes of light. The sky will hang low and the clouds will dance to escape a life unheard and unseen, so close to our ears. When the butterfly speaks, all the dead leaves will shift to listen, reconnect, and reconcile with a vast well and umbrella network of sound, moving all of our minds and resonating an ecosystem of truth. Meeting barbulette de mi sanger. When the butterfly speaks, however small that sound might be, however long it might take, however hidden that place might be, it will be heard.
Wow. On that note, again, thank you everyone who's online, to our online guests for joining us. Where some of you are is the middle of the night. We really appreciate you staying up. To our table guests, Raoul, and to Wim, and my co-creator, Katie Streek, my sister and friend, and to our guests in the audience, thank you for joining us. We really appreciate it. Verzetsmuseum, thank you for having us, and we look forward to the next time. Good evening.
Thank you.
Selamat tidur.